You bought the expensive bag of fertilizer, you followed the directions on the back, and your tomatoes still came up pale, your roses still dropped their buds, and your soil still feels tired by midsummer. Meanwhile, in the gardens around Kyoto and along the mountain terraces of Nagano, families have been growing thick, heavy harvests for generations using a single white mineral that costs almost nothing. No branded chemicals, no yearly trip to the garden center, just a handful of crystals and a way of thinking the modern world quietly threw away. Here's what almost no one will tell you. In the 1950s, Japanese household gardeners developed at least 23 specific ways to use simple magnesium sulfate, the mineral most people call Epsom salt, to fix problems that gardeners today still pay hundreds of dollars a year to chase. Many of these methods were set aside when commercial fertilizer companies rose to power. Some were even discouraged. And now, decades later, soil scientists are looking back at those old techniques and admitting something uncomfortable. They worked because they targeted the real cause of weak plants, not the symptom. Stay with me, because the most powerful of these methods comes from a region in central Japan where farmers kept it alive in their notebooks long after it disappeared from the books everyone else read. It costs you almost nothing. You can start it this weekend, and it works even if your garden's already struggling right now, even if you think you have already tried everything. Let me start with the mistake nearly everyone makes, because until you understand it, none of the rest will make sense. When your plants look weak, when the leaves yellow between the veins, when growth stalls and flowers refuse to open, what do? You feed them, you reach for nitrogen, you buy the bag that promises bigger, greener, faster, and for a week or two, the leaves look a little better. Then the problem comes back, sometimes worse than before. So you feed again, and the cycle repeats, season after season, bag after bag. Here is the part that stings. In most of those cases, your plant was never starving for nitrogen at all. It was starving for magnesium. And piling on more nitrogen-heavy fertilizer actually made the magnesium shortage worse, because aggressive growth burns through magnesium faster than the plant can pull it from tired soil. You were feeding the fire and wondering why the room kept getting colder? Magnesium sits at the very center of every green leaf. Literally. The molecule that makes a leaf green and lets it turn sunlight into food, chlorophyll, is built around a single atom of magnesium. Take that atom away and the leaf cannot make food. No matter how much sun it gets, no matter how much nitrogen you dump at its roots, the yellowing you see crawling between the veins of your older leaves while the veins themselves stay green, that exact pattern is the classic signature of magnesium hunger. Gardeners across the West see it constantly and almost always misread it. The Japanese gardeners of the 1950s did not have soil test kits in every kitchen. What they had was observation passed down with precision. They watched the leaves. They learned to read that yellowing as a specific message, not a vague cry for more food. And they answered it with the cheapest correction available to them: a spoonful of magnesium sulfate dissolved in water. The result was not a miracle. It was simple chemistry, returned to balance. So let me explain how they actually used it, because the dose and the timing are everything, and this is where the buried knowledge lives. The most common method, the one a household near Kyoto would have used on its summer vegetables, was a foliar spray. They dissolved roughly 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt into 1 gallon of water, no more, and they sprayed it directly onto the leaves in the cool of early morning. Not the roots first, the leaves. Why? Because a leaf in magnesium distress can absorb magnesium directly through its surface far faster than the roots can deliver it up the stem. When you spray a struggling plant in the morning, the magnesium passes through the leaf tissue within hours, and that magnesium atom goes straight to work rebuilding chlorophyll. People who try this for the first time often report that the green returns within 2 or 3 days, not because it is magic, but because the leaf was simply waiting for the one ingredient it could not manufacture itself. Treat the leaf first, feed the root second. That order matters more than the amount. Now, the timing the old gardeners followed was tied to the plant's life, not the calendar. They sprayed at 3 specific moments. The first was just as seedlings put out their 3rd and 4th true leaves, the moment the young plant shifts from living off its seed to feeding itself, when its demand for magnesium spikes. The second was right before flowering, because forming buds and blossoms draws magnesium heavily. The third was as fruit began to set, the most demanding moment of all. 3 sprays spaced across the season, each one timed to a moment of real need rather than a routine. That precision is why a few cents of mineral outperformed bags of generic feed. But here is where I need to say something clearly, because the internet is full of bad advice on this one. You will find people online telling you to throw Epsom salt at every plant every week in heavy doses, as if more is always better. Please do not do that. Magnesium is essential, but it lives in a delicate balance with calcium and potassium in your soil. Flood the soil with magnesium and you can actually block the plant from taking up calcium, And a calcium block gives you blossom end rot on your tomatoes, the very problem many people are trying to solve when they reach for the salt in the first place. So they pour on more and they make it worse, and they never understand why. The old method was restrained for a reason. A light foliar spray at the right moment puts magnesium exactly where it is needed without drowning the root zone or upsetting the balance below the soil. If your problem is yellowing leaves and stalled growth, the spray is your tool. If you dump cups of salt around the base of every plant every weekend, you are not gardening, you are gambling. Honestly, just skip the heavy soil drenching habit. The targeted spray does the same job without poisoning the balance your plant depends on. Now let me get to the methods that go beyond simple feeding, because this is where those 23-year-old tricks become genuinely clever, and where you start to see why scientists looking back are impressed. The Japanese gardeners use magnesium sulfate to wake up seeds. Before planting, they would soak certain seeds, peppers, tomatoes, beans, in a very weak Epsom solution, roughly a teaspoon to a quart of warm water, for a few hours before sowing. The magnesium helps strengthen the cell walls of the emerging seedling and supports the early enzyme activity that drives germination. Seeds soaked this way tended to come up faster and stronger, with that first flush of growth that gives a young plant its whole head start for the season. It cost them nothing. A teaspoon, yet it shaped the entire harvest. Because a strong start is a strong finish. They used it on transplants too. When moving a seedling from a tray into the ground, the shock of transplant can stall a plant for a week or more, the roots tearing slightly, the plant pausing to recover. The old gardeners would water the new transplant in with a mild magnesium solution. The magnesium supported the rapid root activity the plant needed to reestablish, and it eased that transplant shock so the seedling kept moving forward instead of sulking. Anyone who has watched a perfectly healthy seedling sit frozen and yellow for 2 weeks after planting knows exactly how costly that pause is. A whole growth window, gone. And here is a use that surprises people. They use it on their lawns and their moss gardens. A lawn that looks faded, yellow-green instead of deep green, especially on sandy soil, is very often magnesium starved, because sandy soil simply cannot hold the mineral and rain washes it away. A light dusting of Epsom salt dissolved and watered over the grass restored that deep color without the explosive, mow it twice a week nitrogen surge that branded lawn products force on you. The Japanese approach was never to push the grass into frantic growth. It was to correct what was missing and let the natural color return. Slow green lasts, forced green burns. Let me pause here because I know some of you are listening to all this and thinking, this is wonderful for people with land, but I have a balcony. I have 3 pots on a windowsill. I have heavy clay and a tiny patch of shade. This is not for me. It is exactly for you. In fact, container plants and small space gardens suffer magnesium loss faster and harder than anyone, and this is something the old methods understood deeply. Here is why. Every time you water a pot until it drains out the bottom, you are washing minerals out with that runoff, and magnesium is one of the first to go. A potted plant lives in a closed world. Whatever leaches out is gone for good unless you replace it. So container gardeners are often fighting an invisible constant magnesium drain, and they have no idea because they assume the bag potting mix is everything covered. It does not after the 3rd or 4th month. So here's what you can do this very weekend with nothing but a watering can and a spoon. Mix 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt into 1 gallon of water. Stir until it dissolves completely. Once a month, no more. Use that solution to water your container plants and your potted herbs in place of 1 ordinary watering. That single monthly correction replaces what the constant drainage steals. Your basil stops yellowing. Your potted pepper sets fruit instead of dropping flowers. Your container roses hold their color. 1 spoon, once a month, and the closed little world of the pot stays in balance. You do not need land. You do not need tools. You need a spoon and the knowledge of when to use it. And for those of you with difficult soil, heavy clay that bakes hard, or thin sandy ground that holds nothing, the foliar spray is your great equalizer. It bypasses the soil entirely. It does not matter how stubborn your ground is when the magnesium is going straight through the leaf. So the very people who feel most locked out of good gardening, the ones with the worst dirt, are the ones this old method serves best. The spray does not care about your soil. It cares only about the leaf. Now, I promise you that scientists looking back at these methods admitted they were genius, and I want to be precise about why, because this is not flattery, it is mechanism. For years, magnesium was the forgotten nutrient. The big 3, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, got all the attention, all the marketing, all the bright bags on the shelf. Magnesium was treated as an afterthought, a secondary nutrient, barely mentioned. But as soils across the world were farmed harder and fed heavier doses of those big 3, magnesium deficiency quietly spread because heavy nitrogen and heavy potassium both compete with magnesium and crowd it out. The more aggressively people fertilize with the popular formulas, the more magnesium-starved their plants secretly became. The cure that was sold made the hidden disease worse. The Japanese household method, by contrast, never chased explosive growth. It read the plant, identified the missing piece, and replaced only what was missing in the smallest effective amount. That is not primitive gardening. That is precision. And precision is exactly what modern soil science now preaches decades later, after the long detour through dump-it-all-on fertilizing finally revealed its costs in tired, imbalanced ground. There is a word for the thinking behind this, and it reaches far beyond the salt itself. The Japanese practice of tsuchi-zukuri, which means soil making or soil building, treats the soil not as a thing you spend, but as a living relationship you tend. In that worldview, you do not feed the plant, you build the soil, and the soil feeds the plant. Magnesium correction was never about forcing a result. It was about removing the one obstacle standing between a plant and its own natural vigor. The plant was always capable. It was simply missing one atom at the center of every leaf. The deeper lesson here is not really about Epsom salt. It is about a way of thinking. The Western habit, the one most of us were handed, is to treat a struggling plant as a problem to overpower. Pour on more, stronger formula, bigger bag. The Japanese habit is to treat a struggling plant as a message to read. What is it actually asking for? Usually it is asking for less than you think, and for something far cheaper than you've been buying. One mindset spends, the other observes. Let me give you a few more of the specific techniques, because they show how far this thinking was taken, and how many separate problems one humble mineral solved in those old gardens. They used magnesium spray on their fruit trees, particularly when the older leaves toward the inside of the tree yellowed in late summer while the new growth at the tip stayed green. That inside-out yellowing is the tree pulling magnesium from its old leaves to feed its new ones, a sure sign the soil cannot supply enough. A foliar spray on the lower canopy eased that drain and held the leaves longer, which meant more days of the tree feeding itself, which meant sweeter, heavier fruit. They used it on their roses, the plants notorious for demanding magnesium. A rose pushing out bloom after bloom burns through magnesium at a tremendous rate, and a magnesium-starved rose gives you yellowing lower leaves and stingy, short-lived flowers. The old gardener's light spring spray, repeated lightly before each flush of bloom, kept the foliage deep green from the base of the cane all the way up and supported fuller, longer-lasting blooms. Rose growers who rediscover this method often say the same thing. They wish they had known years ago, before all the wasted seasons of pale, leggy plants. They used it on peppers and tomatoes to support fruit set, because the move from flower to fruit is one of the most magnesium-hungry moments in a plant's life. A well-timed spray as the first flowers opened helped those flowers hold and set rather than drop, which is the difference between a plant covered in fruit and a plant covered in disappointment. And they used it cleverly to read their soil. Here's a method that feels almost like a secret. If a plant responded quickly and dramatically to a magnesium foliar spray, greening up within days, that told the gardener the soil was magnesium deficient and a longer-term soil correction was worth making. If the spray made little difference, the problem lay elsewhere, and they did not waste effort or material chasing the wrong cause. The spray was not only a treatment, it was a diagnosis. A few cents of mineral told them what an expensive lab test tells us today. Now, before I give you the most powerful method of all, the one preserved in those mountain notebooks, let me be very clear about one more piece of bad advice you will run into, because it can undo everything. People will tell you to combine Epsom salt with everything, to mix it into every other feed, every spray, every treatment all at once. Do not. Magnesium sulfate should not be casually mixed with certain other treatments, because it can react and form compounds that lock up the very nutrients you are trying to deliver, leaving a useless residue that neither feeds the plant nor sprays cleanly. The old method kept things simple and separate. Magnesium spray was its own act, done on its own schedule, for its own purpose. When you start blending everything into one bucket because it feels efficient, you usually cancel out the benefits you were after. Keep it clean. Keep it separate. Simplicity is part of why it works. So here is the method that to me is the heart of all of this. In the mountain districts of central Japan, in places like Nagano, where the growing season is short and the soil on the terrace slopes is thin and easily stripped by heavy rain and snowmelt, household farmers kept a practice that the lowland commercial growers largely abandoned. They did not wait for plants to show distress. They worked magnesium into the rhythm of the whole season as prevention. And they did it in a specific, restrained way that protected the balance of their precious thin soil. Their secret was not a bigger dose. It was a split dose, time to rainfall and growth, and it went like this. Rather than one heavy application, which the mountain rains would simply wash away down the terraces, they applied very small, very dilute magnesium corrections, the same gentle 1 tablespoon per gallon strength, but spread across several light touches through the season, each one applied just after, never before a rain. Why after? Because applying before a heavy rain on a slope means watching your correction run straight downhill into the valley. Applying just after the rain, when the ground was already moist and the plant was actively drinking, meant the magnesium stayed in the root zone where the plant could use it, and almost nothing was wasted. They matched the mineral to the moment the plant was ready to receive it. This is the principle that the lowland, calendar-driven dump-it-all approach completely missed, and the reason those mountain gardens stayed productive on soil that should, by every measure, have been exhausted. They were not feeding harder. They were feeding smarter, in tune with water and growth instead of in defiance of them. And when modern researchers study how nutrients actually move through soil, how easily magnesium leaches, how plants uptake during active moisture, they find that those mountain farmers, with no laboratories and no degrees, had intuited the exact conditions for maximum uptake and minimum waste. That is the genius scientists now quietly acknowledge. Not a complicated formula. A perfect sense of timing. You can do this version starting this season. Wherever you live, on any slope or any flat bed, keep a small jar of Epsom salt by your tools. After a good rain, while the soil is still moist and your plants are in active growth, give them a light, dilute magnesium feed or foliar spray. Small amounts, well-timed, repeated gently. Feed after the rain, never before. Let the moisture you were given do the carrying work for you. That single habit, matching the mineral to the moisture, is the difference between feeding your plants and feeding the gutter. Let me put the cost in front of you plainly, because this is where the whole thing becomes impossible to ignore. A large bag of Epsom salt, enough to last you an entire season across a real garden, costs only a few dollars, somewhere around $5 to $8, depending on where you buy it. And that bag will still have plenty left when winter comes. Call it, generously, $10 a year. Now compare that to the cycle most people are locked into. The branded fertilizers, the specialty feeds, the blossom end rot treatments, the lawn products, the soil conditioners bought again and again across the season, easily $150 to $300 a year for a household that takes its garden seriously, and often more, with results that fade and force you to buy again, $10 against $200 or more. And the cheaper path is the one that actually targets the hidden cause, while the expensive path often deepens the very imbalance you are paying to fix. That is not a small saving. That is a different relationship with your garden entirely. So here is your simple rhythm, the one you can start this weekend and keep all season. Once early, soak your seeds in a weak solution before sowing. When you transplant, water the seedling in with a mild magnesium solution to ease the shock. Through the season, watch your leaves, and the moment you see that yellowing crawl between the veins of the older leaves, mix 1 tablespoon to a gallon and spray in the cool of the morning. Time your sprays to the 3 moments of real need, early true leaves, just before flowering, and as fruit begins to set. For your pots, 1 tablespoon to a gallon once a month in place of an ordinary watering. And whenever you feed, feed after the rain, not before. That is the whole practice. A spoon, a watering can, and a pair of eyes that have learned to read a leaf. The deeper lesson, the one I want you to carry out of this, is that the modern way taught us to see a struggling plant as something to conquer and handed us a shelf of products to do the conquering. The older, quieter Japanese way taught something harder and far more rewarding. It taught that a struggling plant is not your enemy and not your failure. It is a conversation. The yellow leaf is a sentence. The dropped flower is a sentence. And almost always, the plant is asking for something small, something cheap, something you can give it with a spoon and a sense of timing. One way of gardening keeps you dependent. Returning to the store, season after season, chasing a green that never lasts. The other way makes you literate in the language of your own soil, and once you can read it, you stop spending and you start understanding. Once you see that difference, you cannot unsee it. I want to hear from you specifically. Have you ever seen that exact pattern? The yellowing creeping between the veins while the veins themselves stay green on your tomatoes or your roses or your potted herbs, and reach for nitrogen when the plant was actually crying out for magnesium? Tell me which plant it was in the comments. I read them. And the pattern people describe tells the whole story of how thoroughly this one simple correction was buried. And if this way of thinking speaks to you, the way of building the soil instead of beating the plant, the way of reading instead of spending, then come along with us as we recover more of it. This channel exists to dig up the home and garden knowledge that was simplified away and sold back to us in bags. Next, we go into another method from these same mountain households, the way they use nothing but wood ash and rainwater to control the pests that destroy a harvest. The technique so effective, the commercial sprayers wanted it forgotten. It costs nothing. It sits in your fireplace right now, and once you understand how it works, you will never look at a bag of pesticide the same way again. Stay with us. The old knowledge is still here, waiting, and it still works.